Sorry for the gap in uploads, but today we're going to be taking a look at the Harut by Gear. This is a controlled glass pad. Or I guess the creators describe it more as like a balanced glass pad with a touch of control. Or at least they said they're trying to get as much control out of it as possible without making it unsmooth. So thank you to Gear for sending this out to me in the first place. Like, this is the first product I've ever received as a reviewer, and I'm really glad that it's one that I can recommend because it's objectively a good glass pad. Just all of the quality of life and QC elements that goes into making a good mouse pad are here. So, if you like the design and aren't that picky about aim stuff, go for it. It has my seal of approval there. Pretty much all of my complaints about it will be about the aiming experience, which I'll get into later. But first of all, let's talk about the idea of a controlled hard pad, because it's a bit strange. I was watching Optimum's new SkyPad 4 video with Viscose, and he brings up, I think it was the Super Glide 2, like the thin one, and how that one is more controlled than the previous iteration, and how the fact that it's more controlled kind of defeats the purpose of what he feels like glass pads are good at. Viscose tended to agree, but I don't know, it got me thinking about the reasons why I use glass in the first place. Because I didn't feel like the idea of a controlled hard pad was necessarily oxymoronic. So the normal reasons you use a glass pad, right? Micro adjustments, like directional changes, become really easy. If you're looking for purely speed, you pretty much can't beat a glass pad. There's the durability aspect, and just generally aiming will feel more intuitive because every single motion that the mouse makes is kind of under your control, in the sense that like there's no real outside forces. Like you have to put in all of that extra force to stop the mouse, or else it'll just keep going. And just every movements generally feel more intentional because of how much these small, minute motions in your hand will be reflected in your aim. And, that's all well and good, but I don't think that my top two reasons would be in that list. The first one for me would be the fact that I can use a sleeve with a glass pad. A lot of reviewers will bring up sleeves as a way to be like, yeah, you kind of have to use one, but eventually you just get used to it and you don't really notice it anymore, so it's not that big a deal. I really like using a sleeve with glass pads because it just kind of negates any arm friction that I have on the pad. Especially as I've gone back to cloth pads recently, there are ones that are better than others, but it's just never as good as using a sleeve. I don't know like what's wrong with my arm, it just sticks to everything. And it's not like glue, but it's enough small resistance that fine vertical movements, or really any small movement, becomes kind of difficult. It's just like it gets pulled on the pad a little bit, my skin does. For example, like when I went to play frag punk, I found myself controlling the recoil with my fingers instead of my arm, just because a small amount of resistance to start pulling down was enough to have my arm kind of automatically lean towards the more mobile muscle group here, which was a problem because frag punk's recoil is pretty high, and yeah, I'd run out of range of motion. I end up in this like freakish claw grip and lose fights too that I shouldn't be losing. So yeah, I like sleeves, and that's kind of one of the main reasons I use glass. The second reason is the way grip tension is punished. So when I first started using glass pads, it was because I had this death gripping issue where under pressure I would kind of really tense down on the mouse, and the pitch was that with a glass pad, because there's so little friction, that amount of tension would make the mouse shake. You can see on the screen when it happens. And it was true. It was a good training tool because I was able to tell when it was happening and like mentally counteract for it. But over time, I kind of developed a crutch or technique, I guess, depends how generous you want to be, around this, where I can still aim while being tense by just using muscle groups other than my fingers. And this is a workaround, I'll admit. Like, I'm just an anxious person, and certain scenarios in game will cause me to death grip the mouse, even if it's just for like a short 1v1 that like gets my heart rate up. It's a bad habit, but it's, you know, one that I've learned to work around, and that's another main reason that I use glass pads, because with a cloth pad, that sort of tension and downwards pressure will increase the amount of friction that you experience, which can be a good thing if you can control it. But for me, was just like ended up making pads feel kind of muddy in 1v1 situations. Like micros become really hard because the friction is changing as I'm getting more tense. And yeah, I just preferred how it's punished in glass pads, where it'll make your aim a little bit stiffer and potentially a little shakier, but it won't like lock it down as much. So yeah, those are the reasons why I think a controlled hard pad could be a good use case for me, where I really do like control pads for games like Battlefield or just like target switching games, anything that promotes flick speed, because it's just nice to have a bit of help from the pad to help you manage the tension and just get a bit more consistency for any of these like wider and faster movements. I've been trying to go back to cloth for the past few months just to see like how I fare these days, and it's those two benefits that I miss the most. But there's still that question of what actually is a control pad, and it may seem self-evident, but I do think there is a little bit of ambiguity about what makes a pad controlled in the first place. Because there are two friction variables. Static friction, which is the force that keeps your mouse at rest, and whenever you start moving is the force you're overcoming. It's also present when you change directions, and that's why faster pads can sometimes feel easier to track with, because changing direction feels so effortless. Other force is dynamic friction, which is the force that will stop your mouse while it's in motion. And this is the one that people will use for flick technique. You release some of the tension and let the pad do some of the work. So the reason I think control pads are kind of ambiguous is because either of those two variables being high or above average will qualify a pad as being a control pad in like the general masses' minds. So we have pads that have relatively low static friction but relatively high dynamic friction. Most of Artisan's lineup will fall somewhere in this sort of ratio, and that's why none of their pads really feel muddy. Even like the Type 99, which people consider their quote-unquote mud pad, it really doesn't feel sluggish to me. I'm not like fighting the pad because the ratio of static to dynamic is just so clean. There's pads that have high static and high dynamic. And these pads would usually be favored by like TAC FPS players, where you're doing a lot of pre-aiming, a lot of like movement-based aiming to position your crosshair on the target, things like that. And sometimes that additional static friction can actually aid with stability. You don't make as many unintentional mouse movements, you feel kind of more locked in. And then there's pads with high static and low dynamic, at least relatively. Because these two variables are related, you can't have like obscenely disparate values, right? But they can have different ratios. The point I'm getting at here. So a pad that has high static and low dynamic would feel almost muddy. It's like what happens when you have a really high humidity day and your QCK becomes a swamp, right? Those are the kinds of pads I'm talking about. So the Harut is definitely not a control pad by cloth pad standards. The word that Viscose and I had used to describe the pad the first time we tried it relative to the SkyPad 3 was that the friction was perceptible. You can feel it if you're paying attention to it. However, I did find that the more I use it, the more I found that this friction actually does have a pretty significant impact on the way that you aim. So still, it's worth noting that it's still very fast in the realm of just pads as a whole, and I can't give a full assessment of where this pad falls within the controlled glass pad or hard pad market because I haven't used some of the bigger players in the scene, namely like the Padsmith Empress and the Glaze. I think both of those have quite a bit of support from their users as being like really high-end pads that have a touch of extra control relative to things like the SkyPad 3. So unfortunately, I haven't used them, and I probably will not have the opportunity to. But the Serapad I have used, that's the other entry into that control pad lineup, but it is very different from all of the glass pads. And it also like kind of obliterates mouse skates. So it's a pad that I loved using for about 4 hours, and then my skates were cooked forever. However, it also does kind of illuminate for me that there is something there. Even for relatively dynamic aiming games, I still really liked using the Serapad just for the additional stability and additional stopping power. So anyway, I'm like beating a dead horse with this friction conversation. Let's talk about the Harut a bit more. I compared this thing to the Kazemi and the SkyPad 3 in my testing period. I've used all three of them, mostly the Harut, but I would go back to the other two just to make sure that my ideas and my observations still held salt as I would go back and forth. So the reason I picked those two pads was because the SkyPad 3 is just like the gold standard for fast glass pad, right? It's just safe. Compared to the SkyPad 4, it's much less prohibitively fast. It doesn't like feel like I'm losing control of the pad or like it's creating issues in my aim. It's just like both of the variables are very fast, but it's not extraordinarily fast. The Kazemi, to me, doesn't feel that much harder to make micro adjustments, or just like generally the static friction feels pretty similar. It just helps me with stopping a little bit more, which is pretty cool. It has that additional element of dynamic friction that the SkyPad lacks, and does what it sets out to do very, very well. The Harut is more like the third kind of pad I've described when I mentioned control pad, where the static friction is a bit higher relative to the dynamic friction, at least compared to the two pads that I tested against. And I definitely do not think that makes it muddy. That's definitely not a fair assessment. This thing is just like too fast to be muddy, basically. And the balance isn't so bad as to be like uncomfortably imbalanced. However, just compared to the Kazemi, it does strike a very different balance, and it's got some quirks to it. But before I talk about those quirks, I want to talk about the objectively good things about it. Because it's basically everything, where all of the things on paper, all of the statistics, all of the specs are really, really good. In terms of arm stickiness, I could probably play without a sleeve for a little. Wouldn't really destroy me like it would with the SkyPad 3, for example. My arm does have mobility, and I think it's only bested by Glassworks pads. At least, yeah, the ones that I've used. Which is very high praise. Like that pad kind of blew me away with how smooth it was on the arm and how much I wasn't getting stuck to it. And neither pad is one that I would really love to use without a sleeve. I just like having as little friction as possible on my arm here. But this one is definitely very usable if that's something you prefer. And I know that when Viscose tried it very briefly, she really did not mind using it at all. So it was very briefly. So take that with a grain of salt. However, I do think for people with normal skin, it's not as bad of an issue. I don't know what's wrong with me. And then the other thing is the smoothness, where again, I think it's only second to Kazemi. And the developers, the creators, said that it was an intentional design choice, which I found. Oh, am I dead? Okay, sorry. Which I found interesting, because I did have the thought of like, is there such a thing as a pad that's too smooth? Because it is nice to have a little bit of additional feedback from your pad as for like how, just like a little bit of pad feeling. For example, the Red Obsidians were a great example for me as of what a pad that is too smooth feels like. Or not a pad, but like an aiming experience that is too frictionless feels like. It just has no feeling from the pad because of how I can't even really put it into words. It's like an airy feeling, almost like an air hockey table. felt great to move my mouse around, but really did not feel that great for aiming with, just because it's nice to have that tiny bit of extra feedback. And this thing definitely does sit between the SkyPad 3 and the SkyPad, not the SkyPad, the Kazemi in terms of smoothness, leaning more towards the Kazemi. It is a very smooth surface. So if that's something you're looking for, it's definitely enjoyable. Ooh, that's... And in general, I just really enjoyed my time with this thing. This thing made me go back to glass and made me like really certain that I just prefer it as an aiming experience, because, you know, even though I've been using the entirety of Viscose's Artisan collection, which has like, you know, 30 pads, it actually could probably break my leg to stack all of her pads and then put them on top of my legs. It's a lot. I still found myself like enjoying this pad over all of those just because I really like glass pads, and being forced to like go back to it and spend time with this one was like a kind of a treat. Just, I'm at home with this sort of thing. So yeah, let's get into the critique now. It's mostly about the friction, where having relatively high static friction to the dynamic, at least comparatively to the other two pads I tested, is a little bit problematic for certain types of aim. I think the main use case for a pad like this would be pure tracking game. I really enjoyed having that a little bit of extra stability for like my duels in Battlefield, for example, which are a little bit more tracking heavy. It felt really nice to have that additional help with just keeping my crosshair really steady on target. And it kind of developed a confidence that I was lacking in Battlefield for the past few weeks or so. Just having a little bit of additional certainty to my movements. Even though like my accuracy stats probably weren't that much better, my aim looked slightly more smooth, and also I was just generally more confident. So the main downfall of this particular pad's friction balance is the fact that it doesn't really feel like it helps me stop significantly more than the Kazemi. And for a control pad, that does present some issues. So I think the biggest one would be flick technique. A lot of the times I would find myself putting in a little bit of extra tension and force to try and make the pad, to try to overcome the static friction the pad has. And because it doesn't help me that much with stopping, I would find myself kind of overflicking a lot, and generally ending up, if I didn't overflick, I would end up with more tension in my aim than I would with other pads. I would guess that my average level of tension was just higher on average. Oh my god, that sentence was terrible. The other issue that this pad has, for me at least, is that one of the main two benefits I mentioned for glass pads was the fact that I can push into the pad and not have it affect the friction at all. And that's not really true for this pad. Especially compared to the other two pads, there is a noticeable increase in static friction, or just general friction, that came when I was under pressure and I was tensing and pushing down the mouse. Again, this is kind of a skill issue because I could just control my tension better, but you know, it's one thing that I've kind of crutched on, I suppose, and to have that not be present in this particular pad did pose some issues for me. I have some clips of me whiffing really embarrassing sprays because I just found it super difficult to micro under pressure. But yeah, for games that I typically play that have a wide variety of aiming styles, it doesn't entirely suit my preference. Yeah, I think that if you played a game like Overwatch, or even something like TF2, where most of the time it's not ideal to just like max out flick speed or like try to optimize for it, it's better to just to be smooth and consistent. I could definitely see this pad having a lot of utility for somebody. Like all these other characteristics sound good to you, then yeah, I think this pad could definitely be a contender among the best of the glass pads. But one story I wanted to tell is the fact that when I first got this pad, I asked Viscose for an extra pair of Jades, a fresh pair of skates to try this pad with, and she gave me ones that had the plastic coverings on, like a screen protector. and I didn't realize mine never came with that. So I spent like 40 minutes testing this pad with the plastic cover on, and I was like, damn, this thing is actually really cool. It really feels like the most cloth-like glass pad I've ever used. It doesn't feel like too muddy, and it really leans a lot into the control. And then Viscose also tried it and mostly agreed with me. She thought it was a little bit muddy, but also was trying something interesting, did it pretty well, and yeah, I mean, she didn't notice the plastic was on either, so I feel a little bit vindicated for that. However, it does have two lessons from that. One is that the included Obsidian Pro's errors that come with the retail versions of this pad may actually make it more what they set out to do, as controlled as possible without giving up smoothness. I haven't used those skates, but I've heard they're pretty good. And if they're like the normal Obsidians but less sticky, then I could see that being like a really nice use case, and maybe more in line with the pad experience I had at the gate. Uh-oh. I'm getting comboed. Alright, we're good. And the other thing is that it's probably not that skate sensitive. If neither me nor Viscose, who have used hundreds of skates, was able to tell. Maybe if it was on a pad we were more familiar with, we would have been more keenly aware of it, but it is really funny that it managed to trick both of us. But yeah, that's basically all I have to say about it. I don't feel comfortable giving it like a score or calling this a review really, because like I only have maybe a week or 20 hours of playtime with this thing, and I do feel like for something that's this relatively unique, I would say, it's not really fair for me to call it a review with that little time played. However, it's definitely good. I don't know, I probably should give it some more time, because right now I'm aiming pretty good. But yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. I probably will have like a little Battlefield 5 frag video, because I ended up getting a decent amount of clips from my time playing, and it would be fun to just throw it together, maybe put it on Twitter. But I'll put it on after this if you feel like watching. I also have, real quick, HTX Mini. Holy, this thing is weird. I don't know how to feel about this thing yet. This is actually literally my first time using it, so just like secret first impressions. This thing is so weird. Oh my god. Okay. Yeah, we'll talk about that one later. Actually, that might have been DPI related, because somebody else was using the mouse. It's probably on double DPI. I thought it was a center position issue. Maybe it's not that weird. Anyway, see you next time. Thanks for watching.
I'll be the grapes fermented, bottled and served with a table set in my finest suit, like a perfect gentleman. I'll be the fire escape that's bolted to the ancient brick, where you will sit and contemplate your day. I'll be the water wings that save you if you start drowning in an open tab when your judgment's on the brink. I'll be the phonograph that plays your favorite albums back as you're lying there, drifting off to sleep. I'll be the platform shoes, undo what heredity's done to you. You won't have to strain to look into my eyes. I'll be your winter coat, buttoned and zipped straight to the throat with the collar up, so you won't catch cold. I want to take you far.